Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me in the locker room on Wednesday, May 24th. I'm Alan Locher. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and I wanted to bring a show that tackles this subject and doesn't shy away from the conversation. We are at a unique time in history when people we all know and love are suffering from isolation, anxiety, and depression, fear of death, and losing loved ones to suicide. Helping to lead today's conversation is Dr. Charissa Chamorro, who left her career in acting to focus on a career in the mental health profession. Dr. Chamorro specializes in the evaluation and treatment of anxiety disorders, obsessive-compulsive spectrum disorders, ADHD, and perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. Also joining us to share their own personal journey with mental health are Ryan's Hope, Brian McGovern, and Guiding Lights, Michelle Ray Smith. Dr. Chamorro and I are going to kick off this conversation, so please help me welcome Dr. Charissa Chamorro to the locker room. Hello there.
Hello, Alan. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for being here to help guide us through a really important conversation.
It's my pleasure. I'm so glad that I can join and contribute to such an important conversation during Mental Health Month. And as we discussed before I joined you, every day should be Mental Health Awareness Day.
It really should. And you know, as I said, we don't want to shy away from these conversations because, you know, these conversations really can help others.
Absolutely. You know, in reflecting on what we were going to talk about in the subject matter and some of the things, the very serious subject matters that are going to come up, in terms of mental health issues and suicide, one of the main contributing factors or risk factors for mental health issues and is in particular suicide is isolation. So in having this conversation, I hope that we bring more awareness and also give people the courage to speak up and connect with others, and in doing so increase those protective factors, which we know is connection.
Well, I know already in some respect, you know, people who watch the locker room have reached out to me to share their own stories about some of these issues. So let's go back. You told me as a child that living in Chile, you would get lost in books.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about those books and the impact they had on you and the direction of your life.
Yes, absolutely. So it was my love of books and reading that has really connected me to the world of acting and also psychology. So I lived in Chile as a child during the Pinochet dictatorship, and it was a very tumultuous time. It was very frightening living in a country that was going through such turmoil, and I would escape into books. And I was so fascinated by people's stories. And I was particularly drawn to characters who had gone through incredible hardships and who showed great resilience in the face of adversity. And so I would find books and get lost in books. And that was really how I coped through living through such a tumultuous time in another country. And then when I moved back to the United States, there was a local theater company that was doing a production of one of the books that I read. And so I wanted to be a part of that. And that was my first experience as an actress, where I got to embody another character and play a character who had gone through great adversity and had shown resilience. And I loved it, and I felt like this is what I want to do. I want to be able to tell people's stories and give other people an opportunity to experience hope and to see what is really such a common human characteristic, which is our capacity for strength and change. And so that's what drew me to acting. And then I went and studied professional acting at Boston University, and was so fortunate to get my first job on One Life to Live and soap operas, and was on television. And in doing that, again, I got to play these really incredible characters and explore different people and tell these different stories. And I really loved that.
And you said that working on One Life and Guiding Light, you participated, in Jerry Verdorn's Daytime Stars and Strikes, and did work with the Ronald McDonald House. What did those experiences teach you?
Yeah, I was so fortunate to be involved in those incredible organizations. And I found in working with the children and the families through doing the fundraising and awareness that I really wanted to have more of a direct impact. So I actually started by using my background in dance and yoga. I was also a yoga and ballet bar teacher. And I I created these therapeutic movement classes for pediatric cancer patients and their families. So I became more directly involved with these children and these families. And then what started to really strike me is how common the experience of anxiety was, which is so understandable of these families that were going through these immense hardships. And there was so much anxiety and so much depression. And over the course of doing that work, I started really reflecting on how remarkable it is that we all as humans have these experiences, these very difficult emotional experiences. I tell you, I work with people who have anxiety. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I say I work with people who have depression. You know what I'm talking about because you and everyone has experienced those feelings on some level. And yet some people seem very capable of sort of knowing how to cope and knowing what skills to use, and other people struggle at different points in their lives. So I became very interested in how do people cope, and how do people harness that internal strength and resilience, and how can I help be a part of that? So that was sort of the catalyst of me starting to consider the career change that ultimately I did.
And everybody must cope in different ways. I mean, just thinking of anxiety and depression and grief, I mean, we all have such different reactions to all of those things.
Yes, absolutely. And as you said, everyone is different in terms of how they respond to different life experiences, to different transitions, to trauma. And sometimes I think it's also a very common human experience to need support in various ways. So some people can access that support through a family member or a loved one or a best friend. And for some people, it's more effective and really necessary to work with a mental health professional. And so there's really a range in needs in terms of how people need to process, but oftentimes it's helpful to process these very powerful emotions and challenging experiences with another person.
Talk about your path to becoming the doctor you are today. I think you said you started in social work and then research and then psychology.
Yes, I initially was drawn to social work because of the work that I was doing with children and their families. And so that was really more in the social work realm. So I got my master's in social work at New York University. And then while I was on that path, I was working at Columbia University as a social work intern, and they were conducting a couple of research trials in pediatric anxiety and OCD. And I was very interested. I was like, this is so amazing. They are on the ground creating research, new treatments for these issues that people are struggling with. How can I be a part of that? So I joined the research team at Columbia University and loved it, and realized that in addition to doing individual treatment with people and with families, that I wanted to have a bigger role in this work, and that I could do that through research and through teaching. So in realizing that I wanted to have sort of three parts to my career, individual treatment and research and teaching, I decided to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology. And so that is what I went on to do. And I'm now a clinical psychologist, and I am so fortunate I get to do all of those things. So I now currently work in private practice, seeing individuals, children, adolescents, and adults who experience anxiety disorders, depression. I often work with parents who are experiencing all the challenges and joys of parenthood and how to manage those things. And I'm also involved in teaching and supervising psychiatry fellows at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. So I get to teach as well, which I love working with young trainees and teaching them how to provide these treatments to others.
Wow. Well, how lucky are we that you're joining us today? Thank you. And thank you for what you're doing, because, I know we spoke on the phone briefly, with all of the incredible gun violence that we're seeing, the impact of the pandemic on children's health. Talk about, you mentioned it earlier, the isolation that is driving such anxiety in children.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There has been such an incredible increase in anxiety disorders among, I believe, all groups of people, but we know that, I think the latest statistic I read is that a third of adolescent girls meets criteria for an anxiety disorder, and the number for young boys is not far behind that. So we've really seen a remarkable increase in anxiety in children, and part of that we've found is likely due to the incredible stress and isolation that was experienced during the pandemic. And people are still, we're just coming out of that. People are still recovering from that. And those are just the statistics for children. Parents experienced overwhelming stress, and people who were unpartnered, the incredible isolation there. Elderly people who were not able to access their family members were all of a sudden isolated. So this was pervasive, and it was really a collective trauma that was experienced that people are still reeling from, and we're still seeing. I think we will see the effects for years to come. And the way that we can address that is through having conversations like this and encouraging people to speak up and be open and connect with others and care for their mental health.
I really agree, and I am no doctor at all, but I do think we will see this for years to come. What do we attribute the stigma around the mental health conversation? Why it's taken so long? I'm so really honored that Brian and Michelle are going to join us in a minute and open up about their own journeys. But there really is such a stigma that people won't talk about these issues, even in their own home, let alone to a doctor.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Unfortunately, we have a history of limited understanding in some ways of what contributes to different mental health issues. And also, this is certainly an American trait, but it's definitely also, we see this universally, in that if an individual is not strong enough to deal with whatever hardships they're facing on their own, that indicates some weakness or some flaw in their character. So there is an incredible vulnerability to opening up and speaking out about our individual struggles. And I believe that the increase in openness and conversation that we're seeing now as we're coming out of the pandemic is because so many people were isolated. So many people were disconnected. And so now as we're coming out of this, there's this, I don't think it's just because there's been an increase in stress and anxiety and depression, but an increase in desire for connection around these issues, that we really want to connect with others. And so I think that is doing a lot to decrease the stigma around mental health issues and open up the conversation.
That's great. I mean, hopefully, as debilitating as the pandemic was, hopefully though, it could also bring a positive, nature to it as well.
Absolutely. I've certainly seen that. I've certainly seen people reach out at a much greater rate. And there's been this ability to increase access to services. Certainly it's wonderful that we can be back in person and seeing each other, but now with teletherapy, a lot of people are accessing therapy who couldn't before, or who maybe wouldn't leave their homes. And so they now have access also to mental health services. So as difficult as it was, there are some good things that have come from it.
That's amazing. Well, my next two guests, I know they're here today to shed some light on their own personal journeys with mental health in hopes that by sharing their own stories, they can help others. Please welcome Brian McGovern and Michelle Ray Smith. Hi.
Hi, Alan. Hi, Doctor. How are you?
Hello. Hi.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you both. Well, I know we're going to talk about some serious subjects, and I really do appreciate both of you, your willingness. So let's get started. Both of your dads suffered from depression. I'm curious, for both, when did you first realize your dads suffered? Michelle?
Well, the funny thing about my situation is that we never knew my dad was depressed. We just never knew. I mean, he was always like the quiet one, or, oh, dad's being weird or quiet. But we did not know that he was suffering the way he was suffering. He was very quiet about it. So he was just too proud. So yeah, we didn't find out until after.
And Brian, for you?
Well, I was very young. I actually had to go back to my sister and ask her, how old were we when Dad was suffering like this? And I have two older sisters, and it's my middle sister I was talking to. And she said that she was about 10 and I was around 5. So I was very young. But it went on. He was hospitalized for it. They thought he might take his own life, and he was severely depressed. And then she said that over the next 2 years, he was in and out of the hospital for different treatments.
Wow. Dr. Chamorro, how would you define depression? And I'm curious, like Michelle said, she couldn't tell. How is it diagnosed per se?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We look for, one of the things that I just mentioned is that we all know what depression is. If I say that, you know what that is. And there's a common experience because we all experience sadness and some of the things that go along with depression, and the things that we look for that people commonly experience when they have depression are either a decrease in sleep or an increased need for sleep, feelings of low self-worth, feelings of low self-esteem, low motivation. Sometimes there's difficulty getting up and doing things. So these are all common things everyone experiences. But when an individual has major depressive disorder, we see these difficulties consistently for 2 weeks or more. So we're really looking for a pattern of functioning that is decreased, that is for 2 weeks or more, and that is really getting in the way. So is it getting in the way of socializing? Is it getting in the way of doing work? Is it getting in the way of doing your schoolwork? Are you not able to get out of bed? And is this happening not just having one bad day, but is this happening consistently over a couple of weeks? Then we are looking at diagnosing this as major depressive disorder.
Brian, you said that your dad could be very violent and would sometimes leave for an hour, for days, or even a year. How did you or your sisters process that growing up? Or did you understand what it was?
No, he just, was this, it was interesting because I think this was throughout his whole life with us, because it started very young. When my mom became pregnant with me, I was the last one, and I came 5 years after my middle sister. He left us because he was angry about her being pregnant, as if he didn't have anything to do with that. And so there was always a trigger that would set him off, whatever it might be, and he would explode about something. And for instance, there was a time that I remember fairly clearly. I was very young, probably maybe 6, 7 years old, and I'm standing in the kitchen, and my two sisters were trying to learn to be cheerleaders, and they were standing on their heads in our living room, and my middle sister fell over, and her heel hit we had these wooden blinds in that room, and she broke one of the little blinds, one of the little slats, and he came in, and he took off after her, and he was running around the sofa after her. And my older sister tried to stop him, and he just started beating her with, and even as a kid, shoot, I didn't want to get emotional, but already, but even as a kid, I was so scared that he was going to kill her because he was beating her so severely. I'd never seen anything like it. And so he would have these violent episodes over small little infractions. And then if he wasn't hitting you, he would just pack his things up and leave. And like you were saying, he would leave, a week at a time, a couple months. And one time, due to my infraction, he left for a whole year. And that was due to me. I skipped a swimming practice one day, and he packed his things up and left. And it was a year before we saw him again. And so it just was a dangerous place. You didn't know if you were going to be attacked or if you were going to set him off and he was going to leave. So all of us were always trying to keep everything perfect, everything right. When he was coming home from work, the house had to be perfect. No toys could be out. The TV couldn't be on. Nothing could be in any way upsetting to him, or he would explode. And so it just, growing up, it was always just a dangerous, dangerous atmosphere.
I can't even imagine the fear that would instill in the three of you. Yeah.
And I want to go back to your initial question too, is you were asking, was I aware of his depression? And I, said I was so young. And Dr. Chamorro, you can answer this. If those two things, the violence and the depression, are the same, I don't know if these were separate, portions of his life, different emotional states he was in at different points in his life. But, as far as my awareness of his depression, I had two memories. One was walking past their bedroom, my parents' bedroom, and it was in the middle of the day, and he was sitting on the edge of his bed, just slumped over. And I think as a kid, you always imagine your father as this strong sort of superhero. And he looked so broken to me, even as a very young child, that image has stayed in my head my whole life. He just looked so sad and broken. And I don't know how long, he would stay in there. And I think it was long periods, but it was just that memory that I remember that. And the second thing was, that made me realize I was more aware of what was going on than I thought, was there was a couple of buddies of mine, we were very young, maybe, 7, I'd say, maybe 8 years old, wanted to ride our bikes to the beach one day. We lived in Los Angeles or California. And we were going to take them through fields and different things. There were lots of farms at this time in the area that we lived. And so we were going to be off road, and I tried to get my bike out of the garage, and somebody had locked it up, and it was really frustrating, and I couldn't get it unlocked. And so I had to take my sister's bike, which was way too big for me. And I couldn't go off in the fields like, we wanted to do. And we were about a block from my house. And, after all this frustration and all this stuff was going on in my life, my personal life, my home, I banged my knee on the gear shift on my sister's bike and just broke down in tears. And I remember my two friends just looking at me like, what is wrong with you? Because it was not that bad of an injury. It wasn't that big a deal. And also, I think as boys, it was rare that we saw each other cry. You kind of learn, babies do that, and you're always pushed not to show emotion. And here I was just completely falling apart in front of my friends. And I couldn't even speak to them. And I just took my bike and walked home and left them. And I remember getting home and thinking in my head, am I going through what Dad is going through?
Wow.
So I was obviously aware of what depression is and sadness, severe sadness. And even though you think, as a young kid, how much was I really understanding? Children really do know, they may not be able to articulate it, but they know.
Mm-hmm. Brian, something that you said really struck me. And I want to address both things you said. You asked, does the violence go hand in hand with depression? And we don't typically see that as a symptom of depression.
Right.
And it sounds like there was so much going on with your father that it was really very complicated. And not knowing him, I don't know what those things are, but it sounds like there were many, many issues. And what really struck me about what you said is that one of the times he left, it was because of something you did. And it was certainly not because of anything you did. And I'm sure you know that, but just like the violence was not necessarily because of depression, but was related, that it sounds like there were so many complicated things going on for your father, and that any trigger could set off this way of coping. We started out by talking about coping strategies and how different people cope. And some people don't have those resources and those skills. And it sounds like that was something he really needed and never learned.
Right.
Yeah, it's so true. And you know, Brian was just talking about, you know, boys crying back then. I mean, no, I mean, people tried to say that boys shouldn't cry, and that's ridiculous. I mean, I think that's probably what leads to a lot of people bottling up emotions rather than expressing emotions.
Absolutely.
And Michelle, which you've talked very openly about your dad's suicide in September of 2003, and you said that early that year you started to see a shift in his outlook. Can you describe what you felt before it actually happened?
Yeah, the last year of his life, looking back, reflecting, because you know this is what happens. You look back and you're like, oh my gosh, it was so obvious. You know, he became more like withdrawn, I guess, a little bit. He was always very quiet, so that's why my situation's just so different. Is that nobody knew? Oh, Dad's just quiet. And we were like, okay, my mom's, you know, a big extrovert like me. Well, he's just quiet. Well, I mean, he's quiet because he's freaking depressed, you know, like we just didn't know. We didn't know until the first time he tried to take his life. And then that's when it kind of sunk in, like, okay, wow, something needs to be done here. Like somebody needs to step in here and do something. Yeah, and that was in 2003 in September. So he had tried ultimately the first time, and it was in the garage, and my mother found him in the garage writing notes and letters to my brother and sister, who were 13 and 15 at the time. I was 29. So yeah, I mean, it's, you know, he was sick. We just didn't know. My mother pulled him out of the car. I mean, it was just a nightmare. He was taking Ambien, illegally, which I absolutely 150% of my being believe taking Ambien without doctor supervision had something to do with my dad's mental state. I really do. On top of the depression. And who knows what he was taking at the time. When you're buying it from the internet, do you really know? So I think he was trying to help himself. So that was the first time it happened. And then I was in New York. I had already started modeling, and so I just was calling my mom and encouraging her to try to help him. And, you know, I didn't know I could have called 911. I didn't know that I could have said, hey, my dad's going to, you know, hurting himself, or someone else, come get him. But, you know, I had to forgive myself for a lot of things, you know, like I wasn't his wife. I was his child. So there's responsibilities maybe and things that, you know, were private between my mom and dad that my mom had to be responsible for, not me. Mm-hmm. It took me a long time to get to that point where I was like, oh, it wasn't me, you know, and I, you know, it was tough. I mean, it was tough. He wrote letters to us again. He drove out to where he worked. He parked in the parking lot one night. He had gone to therapy to try to work on stuff with my mom. And, you know, my brother was 13 and 15. And I remember him on the computer typing Dad just walked in. He's pacing the house. Dad's really upset after therapy with Mom. He said he's going to leave. And I said, I'm like, you're okay. It's fine. You're okay. Meanwhile, I know it's not. I know that it's not. So anyways, that's what happened. He parked in the parking lot and wrote letters to everybody and, was asphyxiated. And that was it. And I know this sounds like very hard to understand, but as soon as I took it away from the view off of me and I put it on him, like I feel bad for him and I love him. And I knew that he would never get help, you guys. I just knew he would never go to a therapist. So what was I supposed to do? Expect him to live his life in pain? No. So I'm going to cry. Sorry. Grateful that he's not in pain anymore. And if he's not with me, he's not with me. That's okay. But I know that as a human, as a person, he would never have gotten the therapy and the medication treatment protocol that he would have needed. And so for me, I'm so joyous that I'm grateful too. So it was not great, but what I ended up doing was I got my contract for 3 years on Guiding Light in 2005, and he had killed himself in 2003. So I hired a publicist for 3 years. Alan remembers this. It's really spent a lot of money, which didn't matter to me, to go on a crusade with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention to help people. I hosted events at the Natural History. I walked miles and miles at night with people who suffered. Amazing.
And this is the pain and suffering that is left behind, unfortunately. I know you forgive him because you want him to be at peace, but there's a lot of pain left behind in your family because of it. Dr. Chamorro, in terms of, Michelle was saying like she never thought she could get him to therapy. I mean, it's sort of like what I've heard about addicts. I mean, they have to be willing to get help to do that. Is that the same with somebody, suffering this much from depression? Or
a person has to be engaged to a certain degree. I also believe now it is much more common when someone presents with suicidal ideation that they will be hospitalized and at least will be given some type of really intensive inpatient treatment. So certainly if in my experience in working in the hospital system and in private practice, if someone expresses suicidal ideation, or even if you have a family member who is expressing it, and our recommendation would be for them to present to the emergency room. If someone does present to the emergency room, in years past, they may have just been dismissed, and now it's taken very, very seriously. And if a person's expressing any type of suicidal ideation, intent, and plan, they will be hospitalized, where they can at least, even if they're not ready to engage in long-term therapy, they will be able to get at least short-term intensive treatment, medication management, connection with a therapist, and then they will not be discharged without an appropriate discharge plan in place. And that means being connected with a therapist, being connected with a psychiatrist. So I think that's important for people to know, that if you have a family member who's expressing suicidal intent, please take them to the emergency room. Make sure that they are getting the help that they need. Make sure that they're expressing it, because sometimes people who don't want help will go to the emergency room and then will deny. So it's really important to encourage people to be open and express what they're going through, and know that if they are then hospitalized, they will get that intensive treatment and will not be discharged without an appropriate plan in place.
Seems like it's come a long way.
I hope so. And there's still certainly, we certainly have ways to go. For example, like, what do you do for someone who you are not sure how serious it is, or how to reach them? What if they're not at the level where they're expressing intent, and you feel like they really need therapy? That's where it can still be challenging. And yet I think having these conversations is only helpful, and encouraging people to speak up and speak out, and also to provide support for family members who are the people who love these people who are suffering so much, and encouraging them to get their own support and their own therapy, because that's really important too.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of that, Brian, while you were on Ryan's Hope and living in New York, kind of before cell phones, your sister, your middle sister, who you were incredibly close with, became depressed and suicidal. How did you realize that? Was she expressing this to you, and how did you deal with it living so far away?
Oh, it was intensely difficult. No, she wasn't expressing it in any way that I saw, and we were extremely close. She was my rock, as I said, I think on your last show, Alan. She and I really bonded as children, and she was the reason I got through it. Got through all the stuff in our household, and I really relied on her. She was so strong to me, and when I was on the show, I was only on for a couple of months, and she just had been suffering with depression herself, and she was threatening to take her life, and she had locked herself in a bathroom, and she her husband was trying to get to her, and he got me on the phone and was telling me what was happening, and I didn't handle it well. I hadn't had therapy yet, and this was, of course, the reason I went into therapy. I started screaming at her on the phone, and just telling her, how dare she, how dare you, I need you, and all this stuff. It was all very centered in a way. And, but I didn't know. And I just was so angry that she could even be thinking of such a thing. And I had to go to the show the next day. I had just started. I didn't even think I could ask them for time off. I went in first thing in the morning, because we started so early, and all day I couldn't remember a single line. I couldn't remember my blocking. I could barely function. There are times I wish I could go back and see the series again, because I want to see those episodes. I don't even remember which episode it was. I would have to just be watching and go, oh, there it is, but it was so hard. And I left the studio trying to get back to the subway, to get back home, and to call just to see where things were. And I ran into Paul Mayer, who was the creator of my show. He was no longer affiliated with the show. And
like Dr. Chamorro, he left the business
and went to NYU and got his master's in social work. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, at like 50 something, almost 60 years old. I mean, he's just an extraordinary human being. He and his wife were just the most lovely people I've ever met.
Paul, I will interrupt. Paul not only basically encouraged Brian to audition for the part. Brian got the part,
right, and
then has this run-in on the street that literally saved his life and his sisters.
Yeah. So he stops me and he goes, "Hey, Brian, how you doing?" And I was like, "Hey, Paul." And he goes, "How are things going?" And I don't usually reveal like this kind of sensitive material to, just anybody. But there was like such a sincerity to Paul, and just like an openness that you felt comfortable with, sharing things that are usually very private. And I started telling him what was going on, and he was listening to me standing there, and he just goes into his wallet and he gets his card out and he hands it to me, and he's a social worker, and he said, "If you need someone to talk to professionally, I'm there for you." And I had never considered therapy. I mean, therapy was what my dad needed, You know, it was not something I felt like I needed. And it wasn't that there was a stigma attached to it. It's just something I wasn't seeking out. I wasn't looking actively for a therapist. I struggled with like anxiety and things like that most of my life. I don't feel like, you know, there'd be little moments of depression I would feel, you know, like bad days, sad days, gloomy days, but it was never anything like Dr. Chamorro was saying that lasted for weeks, you know, or anything.
But I would also think at that time, Brian, like, you know, here we are in 2023 having this conversation,
Yes.
and we're still talking about how stigmatized it is. You know, thinking back to that period.
It's an easier conversation today than it was then.
Yeah.
And I mean, I didn't know anybody that, you know, was seeking therapy. You know, there may have been, but it was not something that was shared, you know, so I didn't know anything about it. Anyway, I look at his card. And so the first thing I do is call him. And I said, I want to schedule, you know, when let's do it. And so I started talking to him. And I would leave the show, which was on the west side, and I would walk across the park to the east side to where his office was, and we started therapy. And it helped me so much to just learn how to deal with my sister, and how, you know, when it started for me, I remember my first sessions were like, everything's good. You know, my family was no different than anybody else's family. You know, I didn't think there was anything extraordinary about my situation. I, you know, knew there was rough stuff, but probably everybody suffers with that, I thought, you know. And he just helped me to realize, just usually by his reaction when I would tell him stories about my upbringing, that I realized, okay, this isn't normal. You know, this is not your typical, you know, American family. And the best part of therapy, or the thing that really was so helpful in my particular situation, was a couple years later, my sister started having flashbacks of her childhood, and she didn't know what they were. And they were like so powerful that if she was driving, it would almost make her drive off the road. And then these memories started coming back. And then a face in her face was coming back, the memories of the face. And it turns out that a family member of ours, gosh, it's going to get me, a family member of ours had been raping her from the age of 2 to the age of 7. And these memories were coming back to her. And it coincided, and I guess this is common, it coincided with the age her child was. Her child was reaching the age of her abuse, when her abuse started. And I think that protection, you know, system in our, you know, in our bodies started kicking in, and these memories came back to her. And my family didn't handle it well. My parents didn't protect her. They didn't stand up for her. My dad, his reaction was, oh, that's what teenage boys do, because of this family member was a teenager at the time. You know, and you're thinking, a teenage boy is, you know, doing that with a 2-year-old, you know, how in your, you know, mind, Dad, could that ever be okay, you know, or acceptable? And that's where they stood. And they didn't protect her then, and they didn't protect her when it was happening, and they didn't protect her. Now they were given a second chance to stand up for what was right and be strong with her. And they didn't. They failed a second time. You know, most families don't get a second time. And my oldest sister then sided with my parents, and because of Paul, I stuck with Maureen. I stuck with my middle sister, and I stayed by her side, and I did, you know, everything I knew how to do, thanks to Paul. And also Paul, as a matter of fact, you were talking about Dr. Chamorro, Dr. Mount Sinai. He sent me to become an advocate for rape crisis intervention at Mount Sinai. And I went through the training there. And there isn't much of a calling for males, at least there weren't then. I mean, I was sitting in a big lecture hall and it was just a sea of women. And I was like the only male. And because a lot of people that have gone through something like that aren't looking for help from another male. They're looking for a female. And I don't know if that's changed now, Dr. Chamorro, or not, but there wasn't much of a calling for me. But the training was fantastic, because it taught me so much about when somebody has gone through something like that, how much it just completely changes their life from that moment forward. And it completely upends it. And nothing is the same after that. And it also taught me the statistics of how many women suffer with this, and men, but mostly women, and you know, have been affected by this type of thing. And but I stayed by her, and we tried to, you know, to work with my family, and we finally, both the two of us, said goodbye to them, and we separated from my family. It was the only thing we could do, because there was so much toxicity that we just couldn't keep it going. We couldn't stay just because we were related to each other. We couldn't stay in that relationship. And so the two of us separated from our family. And Alan, I was sharing with you, my father passed away last Wednesday on the 17th. And I hadn't talked to him in 18 years. I still hadn't, but still haven't. Because when we separated from them, that was it. And because we tried to create boundaries, we tried to do everything. And even Paul was encouraging me to try to keep some kind of a relationship with my family and try. And I couldn't.
And the impact of Paul, who you spoke to every week until he died, is that correct?
Yes. The last year was shaky because, you know, he was going through so much. He was in and out of the hospital with he was suffering with brain.
But it's, you know, I well up from that just New York City and the chance meeting of running into him and how he really changed your life. You said, Michelle, I'm curious, when Brian was talking about how his sister, you know, wanted to take her life and how angry he got, did you or any family members respond sort of in that same way towards your dad?
Oh yeah, I mean, there were definitely people in my family who they just got completely ticked off. You know, they just were so angry and frustrated and just like venomous, and how could you do this to me? And those are all real feelings. That's all part of, like, you know, the process, I think, of, you know, going through some kind of healing. But yes, there were people like that. And, you know, I have, like, I guess my own way of sort of dealing with it. I guess I've been in therapy for such a long time. I'm a huge advocate of mental health and being a participant in my own life. I was telling Alan that I was diagnosed, well, in 2012, I had breast cancer. And then after breast cancer in 2015, I was diagnosed bipolar 2. And that bipolar 2 manic, which is very different. And a lot of people don't understand mania because it, you know, it's big and fun and wild and woo, you're the life of the party. But it's, you know, it's just not really ups and downs for me, but just so up. So my point is that, you know, my mental health issues run in my family. I mean, they do. And, you know, whether people talk about it or not, it's so common, you know, it's so common. I know people in my family who would be so much happier if they, you know, talked to somebody and, you know, took the needed steps to be a healthier mental person. But
it's true. You know, it makes me, you know, my parents were Holocaust survivors, and, you know, that was at a time where we didn't have these conversations, you know, and I think of what a professional, whoever might have been, could have done to help, you know, guide their lives after the war and help them deal with something that none of us could understand, you know. So, you know, and Brian, you know, thinking back to, you know, you being a kid, and Dr. Chamorro, I'm curious, you know, with his talk about boundaries, what is your feelings on, you know, what Paul was saying? And, you know, I think boundaries are smart when it comes to putting yourself into certain positions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Boundaries are so necessary. And, you know, and thinking about and hearing your story, Brian, and it's really heart-wrenching. And so someone might think, why was Paul encouraging you to keep some connection? And I don't know what his motivation was, but my thoughts is that sort of bringing this back to connection and how important connection was. And I imagine that he was trying to encourage some type of continued connection. And it's still understanding that after attempting that, you felt that you couldn't maintain a healthy connection with healthy boundaries, and that the only way you could be healthy and move on was to truly move on. And unfortunately, sometimes that is the case. When we can't establish healthy boundaries in a relationship, the only way to be boundaried may be to move on and to establish newer, healthier connections, or to create our own families. Oftentimes people who come from dysfunctional families have to then create their own families.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that includes friends also, like friends, and it may include your therapist, it may include other people in your community, but we have the opportunity as humans, as social people, to create our own family and to create our own positive social connections. And that's what is really the most important thing that I hope people get out of this, is that it's so important to connect with someone else.
Right. I absolutely agree with you. And we can surround ourselves we can create our own healthy family, and we can surround ourselves with people that are healthy and have our best interests in mind. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the main things I learned, is that you don't have to stick with people just because you're, related. You can create a better family.
That could be more dangerous. Mentally and physically, possibly.
Yeah. And like I told you, Alan, before, Paul, in a way, and he was aware of it, he became my healthy father in a way. He represented that to me, and he was, such a great role model, and that really helped me, because when I was entering into a marriage and fatherhood and all those things, I had him as my shining example, Well,
and you have also said, which I think is important for people to know, that therapy can help in this way. Like, you really told your college girlfriend, who is now your wife, that you didn't think you'd ever get married. And Paul has helped you be a better father yourself because of what you learned.
He helped me to really grow up, because there was this part of me, and I think a lot of us suffer with, where does your parent end and you begin? You sort of are, you think you're kind of the same person, and you're not. And he kind of taught me, no, I am not my father, and I am not my mother. I am my own person. And because I kept thinking, well, if I get in a marriage, I'm going to do all the same things they did. I'm going to have depression and anger, and things aren't going to be right, and I'm not going to be able to support a family, and all these things are going to be too much for me, like they were for my father. And so there was this avoidance of that, and I did that with each girlfriend I had growing up. I always kept them at arm's length. I felt like I loved them, but I didn't really become vulnerable. I didn't allow them in, because when you grow up in a situation like that, where you have a person who you think loves you, like a parent, you assume as a child that they love you, they have their best interests in mind, but they do horrible things to you, or they leave you, when you do anything, that upsets them, you start to create this protection thing where you just keep everyone at arm's length, friends, girlfriends, everybody, arm's length, because if I let myself get vulnerable, then I'm setting myself up for that again. And I did. I used to tell my wife, this is never going to work out. We're not going to get married. This is just for now. And it was brutal to say, and I'm ashamed of it now, but I was trying to be honest with her, and just, speaking from the heart. I was like, if you're not okay with that, you should move on, because it's not going to work out with me. And I loved her more than anyone else in my life. And yet I was saying that because that protection thing,
I think we all do that with protection.
Thank God she stuck with me because I've never been happier in my life. And the funny thing is, Dr. Chamorro, is my parents were completely against me marrying her. Completely. And they didn't really have a good reason. It wasn't their choice. And Paul just encouraged me to keep going with that relationship, and that it was healthy and it was strong. And I think that's why it was so foreign to me, is it was so healthy. And so thank God I found the strength and the courage to ask her to marry me and to do that, because I couldn't have found a better person. And I'm, the luckiest guy on the planet. And it's just been fantastic, fantastic.
I think your story is so beautiful and so important and inspiring to share. This is, bringing this full circle to what I was sharing about why I was so drawn to acting first and then to becoming a clinical psychologist and a therapist, is my belief in the human capacity for change.
Right. And
our ability to really persevere in the face of great difficulty and have resilience. And I think it's important. Many, many people have these experiences in childhood that are so difficult, or they come from such difficult families and believe that they are not ever going to be able to make something better for themselves, or that this is it. Yeah. And the reality is that you can do the work and work on yourself and aspire to having a healthy life and a healthy partnership and creating your family with those people that you love and your friends and this beautiful relationship you had with your therapist, and that we are all truly capable of achieving these things and finding meaning and fulfillment.
It's interesting. Paul had on his wall, he had a picture of Malcolm X. And it was from a poster, because Malcolm X had come to New York and was giving a speech somewhere. And it was probably plastered on a wall or something. And he took it down as a young guy, and he's kept it ever since. And he had it framed and on his wall. And he had me read Malcolm X. And I know why, because there was another human being that went through an amazing transformation. In the end of his life, he was a totally different human being from where he was at the beginning of his life. And that was the lesson in that book, for me, was just, and that was, of course, recommended by Paul. He recommended all kinds of books. It was fantastic. All kinds of literature. He was an English major from Harvard. So or a literature major and a writer. So he knew, great material. And that was one book that he recommended that just stood out to me, because that was it. It was this evolution of a human being, and that it's possible. You don't have to be stuck. You can change.
Beautiful, Brian. Michelle, September will be 20 years since your dad. Talk about, I'm sure for you can't even imagine that. What have you, when you look back, what have you learned, and what would you say to somebody if it was sort of the early part of 2003 when you and your mom were trying to find him help? What have you learned over the years that you would want to share with somebody who might be dealing?
Well, I just think, I really think about what I said earlier, that getting into a really great program with a therapist or a counselor that you really like. Don't be afraid to interview people to see if you like them, because doctors can be kind of scary, but they're not. They're awesome. And finding that right connection is super, super important. And, like I said, I just have given it up. Like, I've just let it go. I let it go to the heavens. I'm a very spiritual person. And I really am really leaned into this place of just loving him and forgiving him. And I see him all the time in little, whether it's a little skunk or a little funny song that plays that reminds me of him. And it's always like around the time where I need something, you know, like I'm making a big decision. I'm like, oh, there's Dad. You know, I'm gonna look at there. It's a bird. Look at the hawk. That's my dad. You know, but it's like I try to attach a lot of positive things to that, because would I like him to be here? Of course I would. Is life perfect? No. Did I sit in the corner and cry about this? Yes. Okay. I wasn't a complete stone-faced, you know, whatever. But I also didn't let myself swim around in that, you know, nasty swimming pool full of all of those horrible thoughts. You know, I climbed out.
You took immediate action, like you said
did.
earlier. You spent money. You spoke out. Glamour magazine. You worked with the suicide prevention organization.
I forgot I was on the early show. I saw it the other day. I told my boyfriend, I said, Justin, I forgot I was on the early show. I did. Hoda Copy interviewed me. I was in Glamour magazine. I was all over the place helping people and sharing the story about my dad. And there is one really important thing that is really important to me, is that I always say, and American Foundation for Suicide Prevention helped me with this idea of, like, my father died by suicide. Okay, my dad didn't suicide. He didn't kill himself. It wasn't suicide. It was my dad was sick and died by suicide, because in some circles it's still looked at as a sin to take your life. And by saying, like, by changing it to, you know, my dad died by suicide, it was the mental depression of it, I think takes the edge off. And I like to mention that to people and kind of pass that on. But the way that I've handled it, you know, was to just do as much as
you treated it was a disease that took his life.
Right.
It was a disease, and that's why it was the disease that took his life. And that's why when I found out way later in life that I had some mental health issues, I was so thankful. I remember going, yay, finally, like, so, you know, now I can feel better, and, you know, that kind of stuff. And, but again, I know my dad wouldn't have gotten to that place. I just know. And you might be like, oh, you probably could have gotten him. No, he was an older dad, love you, or stubborn, a freaking mule. Okay.
Yeah,
so,
I definitely think there's a generation thing too, you know.
Yeah. So
stubbornness is not.
I was gonna thank you. My segue into one other point was my dad's age. My dad died 4 days before he turned 50, and I do believe that had something to do with the decision to take his life. I felt like it was really, you know, he was at that, like, midlife crisis. And, you know, and that just compounded the depression. And then, again, like I said, taking those pills that were, you know, from the internet, and, it's just, it was a bad situation. And again, I know with Ambien, just be careful if anyone's taking it. It's a serious, it can have some serious side effects. It can. So I'm not a doctor. I just know from my dad. But yeah, so I've learned that it takes a lot of work to get through it. I've learned that suicide is on the table when you have suicide in your family. It's a conversation. It doesn't become much of a conversation if you don't have suicide. Like my son, you know, being under so much pressure with school, it's on my radar, constantly suicide. You know, my sister, my brother, you know, it's an option. It becomes one. And that's what's really kind of scary about it, is that it's on, you know, it's on the table. Yeah.
I would also just suggest for everyone that we know from research that talking about suicide does not increase risk of suicide, it decreases it. So even if it's not an option, it should always be part of the conversation if it's something you're concerned about.
Yes, 100%.
Thank you so much for adding that. Thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Chamorro, Michelle, Brian, thank you for your expertise and both of your vulnerability and honesty. And this was a beautiful way to celebrate Mental Health Awareness Month. But as the doctor said every month is the, Mental Health Awareness Month. So
Brian, thank you. It was so nice to meet you, and thank you for sharing your heartfelt, honest story. Thank you. It was really beautiful.
You too, as well.
Gratitude to you. Thank you. And Alan and Doctor, thank you so much.
Thanks. I appreciate
everybody stay well, stay healthy.
You too. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Dr. Chamorro.
Thank you both.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Charissa Chamorro, for sharing your expertise, and to Brian and Michelle again for sharing your stories. Join me tomorrow, May 25th at 3 p.m. for a tribute to As the World Turns alum Marnie Schulenberg. Marnie's husband, Zach, along with some of her co-stars and friends, will join us to celebrate her life. If you haven't yet subscribed to my YouTube channel, you could do so down below. Turn on the notifications for reminders of all upcoming shows. If you need help yourself, please text 988 or go to 988lifeline.org for more information. Have a great evening, everybody, and I will see you tomorrow.